I often hear people moaning about setting up tyres tubeless and talking about how much effort it is, but really this shouldn't be a difficult task. And I've got 5 ways to show you how to never fail at tubeless setup. So do like and subscribe if you want more content like this in the future. The first way to never fail is to start with a good base, and that's rim tape. Now, I will always go for tubeless specific rim tape. However, if you are on a budget, you can save a little bit of money by going for something like Gorilla Tape, but you do need the correct width. So do find out what width your rim is and choose the correct width of tape for that. If you already have tape in there and you want to keep it, then do inspect it, clean it up, make sure that there's no cuts or any pieces of tape that are moved from you taking the tyre out, for example. Make sure that that is perfect before your tyres go back on, otherwise it won't be a perfect seal. Now make sure that your rim is really clean and dry before you put any new tape on. You might even want to rub it down with some isopropyl alcohol afterwards, just so that you get a really clean surface, because you want your tape to stick. If it doesn't stick, then that's your first sign of failure. Now, my biggest tip is to start over the valve and to go all the way around once and then come back over the valve. So the valve gets double, but everywhere else gets single. However, if your tyres sit a little loose on your rims, then you might want to go twice around the rim to give a little bit of extra sealing between the tyre and the rim. And finally, get yourself a cloth or a sponge, a dry one, and rub it all the way around the tape. You want to be pushing down firmly on the shoulders of the rims where your tyre is going to sit, and make sure that that is sealed before you go any further. And that's how not to fail at rim tape. Your valves are really important in this process as well. Obviously, you're going to need the right ones, whether it's Presta or Schrader, and you're going to need a good quality pair as well. And don't forget that when you buy a new set, you often get the little rubber plugs here, which come in different shapes so that they fit into your rim properly. Have a go with a couple of different shapes and find out what fits your rim the best, because these need to form a tight seal to stop any air getting out. If you're sticking with the same valves and you're not replacing them, then check your valve cores. Are they moving slowly? Are they letting air in and out too slowly? It could be that the valve cores are a little gunked up, like this one, and you might need to take it out and give it a really good clean, pull all of that dried up sealant off it, or maybe even replace the cores themselves and keep the existing valves. My big tip here is to stab a hole into the tape rather than cut it or cut across, because you want minimal damage to your tape so that nothing can escape. And then when you put the valve in, give it a good push from above so that the rubber piece compresses and you get a really tight closure from the nut on the other side. Now, it's all very well having new sealant and tape and valves, but if your tyres are in bad condition, you're probably going to lose air and suffer punctures anyway. So make sure you have a tyre that is in good condition. You want to make sure that there's not too many holes that you've fixed with tyre plugs, and you want to make sure that they're not so baggy around the rim that air is escaping between the rim and the tyre. If it is and you're going to reuse this tyre, then do try out my trick of running the tape round a couple of times to create a better seal. However, I'm going to be replacing mine completely. If you're running your existing tyres, then make sure that the old sealant has been taken out. It might be too old to work, it might be contaminated, or if it's 2 different brands, then they might not mix well well together. And also make sure that the inside of the tire is clean, make sure that it's dry, get any gunk or old dried sealant off the edges so that it'll work perfectly next time. My final tip is to make sure that the tyres that you've bought are actually tubeless compatible, and also make sure that they're compatible with your wheels. Now, some wheels will specify that only certain brands of tyres will work with them, and some tyre brands will specify that only certain rims will work with their tyres. So do check that out, and also bear in mind that there are things like hookless and hooked rims that can make a difference. So there may be tyres out there that are only specifically made for hooked rims, for example, and you might need to buy the right pair. Now, obviously you need to start with a good sealant to have good puncture proofing, but also don't forget to follow the manufacturer's instructions because different brands have a different strategy. Now, this PT's Whole Shot is about 6 months in life, or 6 months plus. So around about 6 months, you want to be thinking about refreshing it. Old sealant is not going to do a great job. And of course, try not to mix brands either, because if you do, they can have a chemical reaction that will cause them not to work to their best. Some may even mix and split, and then it won't be very good at sealing holes. And finally, use the amount that they have said you should be. Now, you will be using slightly more for bigger wheels like 29ers, for example, maybe slightly less. Go by the manufacturer's recommendations, and don't be stingy when it comes to a new tire, because you will need to seal some imperfections from the get-go. So there's 2 ways to put sealant in, and that is to have half of your tire off of the rim and just pour it into the tire. Perhaps use your scoop or your measuring device if you don't have measurements on the side. Alternatively, if your sealant has a straw, or if you have a syringe that fits inside your valve without a valve core, then you can actually seat your tire dry with no sealant on both sides. Make sure it's all sealed, and then add your sealant through the valve without the valve core in it. It is less messier, but I don't think it necessarily gives you any better of a seal. Sometimes using a track pump alone won't get your tire to seat properly on the rim, and what you're looking for is for that little bead to be evenly distributed all the way around the rim. Now, if you find that you're putting air in and it's just coming out somewhere, perhaps the tire's a little too loose or baggy, then it might be a change of strategy is needed. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can get yourself a track pump that has a charger, and what that will do is it will fill up a canister of air so that you can release it into the tire and then inflate it really quickly. It'll effectively have a rush of air that will shock the tire onto the shelves. Alternatively, if you've only got a track pump and you don't want to buy a new one, you can buy a canister on its own, and that can be attached to the pump and then attached to the valve, and then you can get your rush of air that way. If this is still not working out for you, then I think my biggest tip is to take the valve core out and try it again, because the valve core can sometimes slow down that air getting in the tire. So that is how you never fail at tubeless setup.
It's been a while since we've done a hacks video here on GMBN so today I'm going to share with you a whole bunch of hacks using all of this stuff that I've been using kind of on and off over the years, really, to work around problems that arise when you're working on bikes. Hopefully there's going to be at least 1 or 2 things here that are going to be helpful for you. Okay, the first one is actually referring to a product, and this is it. It's elastic cyanoacrylate. Now, cyanoacrylate pretty much is super glue. You get various different options on the market that you will see. Now, the thing with super glue that you can't use in the application I'm going to tell you about is it's actually quite brittle once it's formed that bond. So you can still use it, but it won't make a permanent fix. Now, what I'm talking about here is when you get slashes in your tyre. Now, yes, by all means, you're going to be able to stab a worm into those and sort of fill that void, but quite often they don't actually completely seal, and you might lose air over time on the ride. So this stuff, the elastic version of a cyanoacrylate, basically means you can use it with rubber and things that move. And I've been using this on trainers and on my tyres for some time now, and it's absolutely brilliant. So here's the theory. So for a number of things, when you're cleaning your bike, you should be inspecting your tyres, and any little cuts and nicks you see in those tyres, they can grow when you sort of ride over stones and thorns and anything. So fill them in with some of this stuff and it'll make your tyres last longer. And also, if you have had to use a Trailside solution to repair a slash in your tyre with one of those plugs, when you get home, you can neaten it up and make it a much more permanent fix by using some of that. It's awesome stuff. Next up is one of my favourite additions to my home workshop, Gorilla Tape. This stuff is super useful for a number of things. Now, a lot of bike packers out there will actually keep some of this on the bike because over time you're going to find something's going to rattle loose, maybe a cable tie holding a hose comes loose in your rear brake hose, for example, might rattle on your tyre, something like that. You can secure it with some of this. And once it's on your bike, you can unpeel it and reuse it, which is quite useful stuff. Now, what I've always done is secure a chain link, like a master joining link on my handlebars on the bike. Some people do this in various places on the bike, but I use this stuff for it because I know it will stay sticky and I will be able to reuse it as well as storing that chain link on the bike. It also makes a fantastic, despite what many people will say, a fantastic option to use in place of proper tubeless rim tape. Now, yes, tubeless rim tape is certainly better and it's going to get a better seal and it's going to last longer. But if you haven't got any, or you need to make a repair to your existing rim tape, this stuff will do the job. It works really, really well. And lastly, just to prove how versatile the stuff is, I actually made this little mini saddlebag entirely out of Gorilla Tape. It's literally, it's a waterproof bag basically. Got a little stick-on Velcro patch on here that I made. And it's got a little Velcro hook and loop strap, and on the inside, as you can see, I've got a CO2 cartridge, tyre lever, and a little adapter in there. And it goes under the saddle, nice and easy. You can make one of those with some of that, and it'll cost you almost nothing. Awesome stuff. Okay, the next one is more of a little tip I've picked up over the years on how to sort of neaten up the cockpit on your bike. Now, you might have found if you've ever shortened the brake hoses on your bike or you've installed a fresh setup onto your bike, that when you actually go to secure that compression nut that goes against the olive to secure the seal on there, that when you tighten that up, you actually find that the hose can twist. Now, of course, it's binding, so there's two ways around this. The obvious one is to sort of pull the hose the opposite way slightly before tightening the nut against it, and then hopefully you've got it in the right position. And the other one, dead simple really, is to put a tiny dab of grease on the non-brake side of one of those olives. Obviously you'll have your compression nut in place on there, just to make sure it doesn't bind when you tighten. That's all you've got to do, super simple. Now, I've actually seen a number of mechanics doing this, and honestly, it's changed my life with certain brakes that have just been a pain. I'm sure more than a few of you will have had this problem. Now, one additional tip within that is if you're using, say, for example, a SRAM brake or an older Avid brake that uses dot fluid in there, when you put the grease in there, try and use some dot grease, because that way it won't be eaten or sort of won't have any issues with the corrosive dot fluid in there. But yeah, super simple little tip, and it works a treat. Okay, chains, we all have them on our bikes and they all break at some point. Usually when you're far from home or you're sprinting and you have a faceplant or whatever. The fact is you've got to fix them to carry on riding. Now, yes, you can use a chain tool and you can put a chain back together with the pins that are in it, but you can't expect them to last because they will break. So what you need to do is carry with you an appropriate joining link. Now, there's obviously various different manufacturers on the market. You've got SRAM, you've got Shimano, you've got KMC, it's Connex, there's loads. And they each have their own dedicated joining link. But the fact is, it doesn't matter which one you have. You can use any of these as long as it's the correct speed. You can use a 12-speed SRAM one on a 12-speed Shimano chain. I'm sure that SRAM and Shimano employees might go at this, but it's a get-you-home hack and it will work. Ideally, yes, to make sure your shifting is as perfect as those manufacturers intended, you want to swap it out as soon as possible for the correct one. But don't sweat it. If you've got one that's the appropriate speed or one of your friends has, you can use it to join your chain. Now, skipping back to the beginning of the video, I always tape one on one of my bikes. And I know if a friend breaks a chain or I break a chain, I'm going to be able to fix it. So just bear that in mind, but don't panic if it's not the right brand. Yes, change it at a later date, but it does mean you can still fix it safely and carry on your ride. Okay, so I've got the little rubber nitrile gloves out. Now these things are great for a number of different hacks. Now the first one comes to mind with people who ride in the Northern Hemisphere is keeping some in your riding pack for those inevitable trailside failures. You can say, well, you've got to fix something, you're going to get cold, you're going to get muddy, you don't want your riding gloves to get dirty, so keep some of these in your bag anyway. You can also use these to keep things inside your bag. Your phone, for example, if you've got a bag that's not waterproof, these will do to keep that waterproof. But they also serve another purpose, which I've referenced in another video way back on GMBN Tech. It's going to be down there about removing bolts that are damaged or rounded out. Now, the first port of call I will always do with something like this is use an Allen key that's got a rifled end like these ones. I have a rifled end so it can grip in the head of a bolt that has been rounded out slightly. And if that doesn't work, my next port of call will be an elastic band or a bit of glove. My preference is to use glove because you can double it up if you need to get a slightly more secure fit, and it just adds enough tension on the head of the Allen key in the bolt there to hopefully get it undone. And it's so far not failed me. I'm sure there's going to be instances where it doesn't work, and I know that a number of GMBN Tech viewers actually tried this hack after seeing me do it in the earlier video, and it worked for them. So I wanted to reshare it because it's simple and you don't have to do anything destructive like drilling the head of the bolt out. So give it a try if you've got a bolt that's got a head that's slightly rounded, and do yourself a favour, just keep some in your riding pack. They'll take up no space and they'll come in handy at some point. Mountain bike freewheels. They can be loud, they can be quiet. Some people love that, some people hate that, with either way. So the fact is, they need to be like this because of the way the engagement works. You get ratchet style ones, like the one you can see on screen, just a shot of, and you get ones that have pulls that engage into little tiny teeth. Now, as you'd imagine, they're sprung to engage in those teeth, and that's going to make that noise, as you hear. Some people love this, like I said, and some people don't, but you can actually choose the amount of noise that it has by the way that you choose to maintain it. Now, of course, each hub manufacturer will have what they recommend down, but something I do recommend checking out is this specific stuff that I actually used pretty much for the first time when I was working with Industry 9, because they recommend it to either silence or maintain their hubs. Now, it's a dedicated free hub oil from Dumont, and this one is a free hub grease. Now, what you want to do, basically, when you're actually maintaining it, you pull it apart, you want to clean everything, clean the surfaces, clean the pulls, make sure there's no debris in there. And if you want your hub to sound nice and quiet and muted, use a small amount of the grease on those serrated teeth and a little bit on the pulls. If you want it to be nice and loud and punchy, use the oil, and that will keep it maintained as well. It's dead simple. Now, I've done this before with various different oils. I found like a wet lube or an all-weather lube can achieve a similar thing, although you can't beat the correct tool for the job, I will say that. And the same, a suspension grease is really thin and actually not too far off what this specific hub grease is, although this is designed to stay in place, whereas suspension grease, of course, is designed for use on suspension surfaces and around rubbers and things like that. So you can do it with other stuff, but that's a great little hack, and you can make your bike sound super loud or nice and quiet. Okay, the next one is, I guess you could say, is in place of using a grease. Now, using greases and assembly compounds is obviously essential on bikes to resist corrosion, things like cups staying in the frame where they shouldn't do, but there's also a time when you can use other things like PTFE tape. So this is plumber's tape, essentially. You'll see this used on threads around plumbing to make it a super watertight feature, but also to make sure that you can undo it again. This stuff has worked a treat for me in the past. Do you know what? I don't even know who I picked this tip up from, but it's a long known thing amongst bike mechanics that have been doing this a long time, to use this on the threads of a bottom bracket. Now, if you're going to do this, you want to make sure that the threads on the actual bottom bracket itself are completely clean. Don't do this with grease on there or any debris. And you want to make sure you wrap almost in the opposite direction to the way you're going to screw it in to make sure it doesn't undo itself. Couple of wraps around of this nice plumber's tape. You want to make sure it's as smooth as possible when you do this so you can thread it in. And essentially it does the job that a grease will do to enable you to assemble it and disassemble it when you need to. But because the tape actually fills more of a void than the grease does, if your bike is subject to a creaky bottom bracket, this almost positively will cure this. I've had this in the past, I've had creaky bottom brackets, and this stuff has been great for it. Give it a try. Okay, this one is a braking hack that I actually picked up from the Instagram account of Pro Mechanic BK, so that's Brad Kelly. If you don't already follow him, give him a follow. There's a handle floating around down there somewhere for you to check out. He was actually the Toolbox Wars champ, I think twice now, and he's got just an awesome Instagram page if you like your tools and things. But he had a tip that I didn't realise I needed when I was just by chance looking through his page. Now, I'm sure some of you out there will have had brake pads that drag before, or maybe sticky pistons, things like that. Now, I did have a particular brake, I think it was a code at the time, that did suffer from this. So I basically lubed the pistons like you do with the dot fluid on those, because it's a dot brake, put them back in, so retracted correctly, bled the brake, but I was still suffering from one of the actual brake pads, and it looked like it was catching or not returning. And actually, it made me realise when I saw his hack, which was to file off a tiny amount on both the leading and the trailing edges of that brake pad, because sometimes, just due to manufacturing, the brake pad, whether it's their own brand or an aftermarket one that might have a different paint, for example, on the outside, can just catch. You've got to bear in mind that the tolerances they're made, they're supposed to slide through that caliper, and if they're just the teeniest bit out, which can happen on different batches, they can catch. And it was actually a non-SRAM pad that I had it happening with, and it appeared that the backing plate was painted, I guess, so you could identify between sintered and organic or something like that. I kind of forget now, but I tried that hack and it worked a treat. Granted, it is a niche hack and you might not ever need it, but if your brake pads are actually sort of not retracting properly and they're sort of just dragging on the side of the disc rotor, have a look closer and see if that's what's happening. And if that's the case, a little bit of filing action on the edge of your brake pads will hopefully cure that for you. And another brake pad hack is for rattling brake pads. Now, you tend to get this with some brakes on the market, and this is a weird one because I've had this on certain XT brakes and SLS brakes, and not at all on the same exact model on a different bike. Can't correlate what that is, can only put it down to the way the brake pads are manufactured. But sometimes the ones with the heat fins on there can actually rattle. And if you're like me, that will drive you mad. So you want it to be nice and quiet. If that affects you, then there's a few little hacks you can do here. Now, one of them is by getting a very small O-ring and literally you just wrap it around the pad itself and it takes that void of space up, and you can either wrap around all of them, but you don't want it to close them in or hinder the action, and you can hook it around the actual pin that holds it in. I've seen that one used quite a lot, although it is quite difficult to get the exact right O-ring or rubber band to do it. It's got to be a really, really small, fine one to do that. But something I've used, and I've seen other people use, is either mastic tape, which is this stuff, so Scotch 2228. It's essentially a rubber tape. You can cut a tiny little bit off and just hang it just on the edges of where the brake pad would actually rattle. But something I think is a little bit more reliable than that, because you wouldn't want it to stick on there and stop the pads retracting properly, is the fluffy side of a bit of Velcro. Now, I've seen this on loads of downhill bikes in the pits, and I've tried it, and it works a treat. You just need the tiniest bit. Obviously, your caliper is going to have to be dead clean for this to stick. It has got a sticky backing to it, and it does mean that when your bike gets muddy, the mud does stick to this, unfortunately, but it will mean that your brake pads won't rattle if that's a problem on your bike. Now, this last one is actually genius. Now, this was shown to me, do you know what, I don't even know. I'm going to say it was Finn at Full Factory. It was shown to me by a mechanic friend, and it was a spray lube hack. Now, I don't use spray lubes. I resist using them as much as possible, and I would always recommend using a dropper bottle of lube if you have the ability to get one, because of the fact you can specifically and precisely put a drop of oil on each chain link. You don't get any waste with these, but more to the point, you can't overspray by accident. What I mean by overspray is if you're spraying the lube on the chain and the mist of that lube goes near your brake rotors, in which case it will contaminate them, and then you're going to be stuck in the realm of, do you try and sort of rejuvenate them or buy fresh rotors and pads? Not good, yeah. So what you want to do if you are using a spray lube is get a selection of these little caps from your old bottles, put them together, and essentially what you're going to do is build a bridge like this. So this side will go on your bottle, and you have to make sure you've got one like this. It's got almost the fine nozzle in the other end that goes into your spray bottle, and that now becomes your applicator rather than out through the actual hose. If it comes out through the hose, it's still going to have a mist. But if you come out via here, as you can see when I spray it, it goes really accurately straight onto the links that you want. It's a wicked little hack, dead simple, and it also works really well for water displacer. For the same thing, if you want to run it past your chain, your drivetrain after washing your bike to avoid corrosion and drive the water out, that works a treat. Give it a try. Okay, so for this hack, what I want to talk about is the problems that you can run into with the cleats on the bottom of your shoe. The bolts can get corroded and stuck in, but more importantly, the actual head of the bolt can get damaged from rocks and things. And two GMBN viewers came up with great solutions for this that I've never thought of, so I just want to share this because I think it's really cool. So the first one is from Scott Gregory, who suggests getting a candle and a lighter and literally melting some wax and dropping the wax in there. So you can obviously scrape it out, but it fills that void, so it's going to seal effectively the head of your bolt. I think it's absolute genius. It works really well. I've done this on my cross-country shoes, but there's also another one you can do, and this is from Graham D, who says fill those cleat bowls with silicone. So some general purpose bathroom silicone sealant, something like that. The same thing. You can plug those holes, achieves the exact same thing. I've got to say, I really like the wax approach. The silicone one though, I suspect will probably stay in a bit better. And it does mean you can just hook it out after a while when you need to make an adjustment. I think that's absolute genius. Anyone got a better one? I'd love to hear it, but I think they are two of the coolest little hacks I've seen in a long time, and I'm going to be doing them to all my shoes. Well, there we go. There was 11 and a bit hacks, I reckon, from a number of things I've done over the years, and I've also learned from other amazing people out there in the community. So thank you for sharing stuff with me that you already have. Big ups, like I said, to BK. Make sure you give him a follow because the guy is just awesome. The stuff that he shares, so cool. And as are Toolbox Wars and all of the mechanics out there.
So you're getting into learning more about your bike. Awesome. Done right, you can save quite a bit on fixing your own bike. And I'll say key to this is creating your own dedicated workshop space. Here's a collation of tips from my own personal experience, from trying to fix my own bike really badly, thanks very much Dad for not yelling at me, to then working with some real master wrenches who helped me sort of upskill, to then becoming a race mechanic, and now working here at the service course at GMBN. Location, location, location. Space is key for a workshop. If you can dedicate a whole garage, a whole shed, half a garage, even a corner of a shed or a garage, you can make a fantastic pro-level workshop. However, if you can only use a shared workbench as your workshop, then with smart organisation, that can be enough. Those with more space, whether it be a double garage even, or an even bigger shed, well, the sky's the limit. Well, actually, it's more the workbench than the sky, isn't it? Well, do go wild. Share your amazing workshops, whether they be big or bijou, on the uploader, which is just below. I've organised my stuff into tools, into drivetrain, so cassettes and chains, then brakes, so spare pads, spare rotors, then wheels and tyres, valves and sealant, and then also greasers and degreasers. If you're anything like me, and I feel like you will be, you'll have probably accumulated a whole heap of spares. Now, some of those spares are going to be useful for your current bike or current bikes, and you might even use them for future projects, but some of them aren't going to be usable at all. Now, collect all those spares together, and depending on how long you've had a bike addiction and your vintage, there might be some gold in that crud. Speaking of crud, old crud catchers and other vintage mountain bike parts can be worth a surprising amount of money to the right collector, so sell them and find out how much you could get. If you're feeling altruistic, you might want to give them to a local shredder or wee little trail nipper. Alternatively, what you could do is find out where your local swap meet is and swap out some of those spares for stuff that you do need. Now, key or word of caution with those bike swaps, the best thing is to try and leave with less than you came with. I know I've experienced the opposite, where I've tried to get rid of spares and ended up coming back with more than I went with. Whilst we've touched on tools already, I think we need to talk more about tools. So I'm a bike nerd, I'm very much a more tools is better, but be realistic. Get the tools that you need for your bike. So yeah, you can go wild and buy a full toolkit with special bearing presses, with facing tools, and maybe lots of cone spanners, because they seem to be in lots of these sets. But will you actually use them? And I say, will you use them? Do you have the mechanical skill to use them as well? So think about which tools you're going to use and which tools you're going to use regularly. So buying a complete set might be great, but buying just the tools that you need might be a better way of buying better tools that you're going to use regularly. I've mentioned this on GMBN before, and it's a workshop essential, and that's a work stand. So you can go wild and you can go mild. So wild, you can get powered stands, which are actually a really good idea for e-bikes. So Park Tool have got the PRS 33.2, catchy title, but it can lift 54 kgs. That's almost Isaac at race weight, so it's definitely going to be able to handle an e-bike. You don't have to go wild, you can go mild. You can get good value work stands from about £80, which is about $100. But the key take home is, for a pro workshop, a work stand is an essential. It makes so many jobs much, much easier. Bleed make a great addition to a workshop. A number of different brands do simple ones that work well enough for a home mechanic to do a biannual brake bleed. But you can go wild and buy dedicated bleed kits that are pro level, just like they're using the World Cup pits, for all the major brands. Do remember that different brake systems use different fluids. SRAM and Hayes use dot fluid. Technically there is a SRAM brake, the DB8, that uses mineral, but in general both of those use dot fluid. And then Shimano, Magura, TRP all use mineral oil. Technically the Magura and Shimano and TRP fluids are all slightly different, but the key take-home message is that dot fluid shouldn't be mixed with mineral oil and mineral oil shouldn't be mixed with dot fluid. And that's because it can damage the seals, the delicate rubber seals inside the brakes, inside the calipers, inside the levers, and also inside the syringes. So get a bleed kit, but make sure it's the right one for your brakes. Speaking of fluids, I touched on greases and degreasers before. Some of them can be toxic, so they should be stored smartly. So ideally, store them in a metal case, store them away from UV light, and that's because some of them can be flammable, some of them can be toxic, some of them unfortunately can be carcinogenic as well. So do keep them away from small hands and animals, which may be one and the same. A great little extra credit tip, especially with grease, is to use a grease gun. It means that you can precision apply grease just where you need it and without getting it all over your hands. Washing up time. So create yourself a dedicated cleaning bucket. Put all your cleaning products, your brushes, maybe your lube, maybe some of the kind of anti-corrosion sprays as well, all in a bucket. So when you go to wash up, you've got all your tools and all your washing up essentials with you. Blake's done a great video on how to wash your bike. Flooring. If you've got a dedicated space for your workshop, whether it be a whole garage or half a garage or even just the corner of a garage, it's a good idea to look at flooring. There's lots of different options out there, whether you go down Neil's route of a two-part epoxy or just sealing the concrete or just putting down some rubber mats. It can make a real difference to controlling those spills and detritus, and key, if you put the rubber stuff down, it might help you stop losing those bits and bolts under the floor. So do have a look at flooring, maybe before you move in heavy workbenches. For a full pro workshop setup, I think power tools are an essential. Okay, maybe they're just a nice addition, but they're still great to have. From cutting tools, rotary cutting tools, like the Works Maker X, for example, where you can customize parts, maybe like a shifter, you can trim and shape it just to be right, or a compressor to inflate stubborn tubeless tires. But with the right adapter, that same compressor can be used for drying out bearings before you lube them up. So yeah, for that true top tier pro workshop experience, get some power tools. Whilst it would be awesome to have a DH World Cup pit setup in our shed or garage, a pro level workshop doesn't have to be huge, it just has to be organised. Now, a very good example of this is JC, Sam Hill's mechanic. He spanners, for want of a better word, out of a small tool roll. So he works on Sam Hill's bike the whole year from this small tool roll because he's got really organised, he's got really smart, and he's just got just the tools he needs, no more, no less.
You may by now have noticed that I like to do the odd epic ride. Quite literally putting hours and hours in the saddle. Crushing miles and pushing myself and my bike to the absolute limit. So it's by doing this over the years that I've come to realise that having my bike set up just right for me, so that it's optimised on both comfort and performance, is actually more crucial than ever. That quest to find the perfect setup and fit brings me here, SQ Lab, a German company specialising in all things comfort, fit and contact point based. A company that since the early 2000s are constantly developing, evolving and refining their products and pushing the boundaries in an area often overlooked. Let's talk to product developer Luke to see how you'd measure yourself to get your bike fitting just right, and also the importance of this. I want you to kind of explain to our viewers at home what a bike fit is and the benefits of doing it, really, because I think the vast majority out there have probably heard of it but not actually too sure what it encompasses.
I think the bike fit is the single most important thing you can do to optimize your performance, pretty much.
Okay.
Because you tend to spend a lot of money on a fleshy frame, fleshy components, which is great. I mean, that's what we live off.
Yeah, we love it.
And we love it. But if you don't adjust these components, the saddle height, saddle setback, the handlebars, the grips properly, then you don't use the full potential of your bike. If you want to get either the best performance or the most ergonomic performance, the best performance for your joints, most healthy position on your bike, a bike fit is always great.
Before we jump on the bike and get into the finer details about adjustment of saddle height, bar roll and stem length, we're going to use the SQ Labs app to determine what ideal components we should spec my bike with according to the data. SQ Labs has a unique and detailed app that allows them to input details about your bike choice, how often and how long you ride for. Also some more important information about your riding style, height and weight. They then measure the distance between your sit bones by scanning an imprint into the app. We've also scanned my full body to determine the length of my arms to help choose what type of handlebar width, upsweep and back sweep would fit me best. We then scanned my hands for reference to grip size, width and diameter, also adding information about what pains I potentially get when riding my bike to help determine what saddle and grip is right for me. Finally, we made an imprint of my foot to see what type of arch I have to find the right sole that would alleviate any potential pain there as well. Before we fit parts to my bike and complete the bike fit, I wanted to find out a bit more about why it's important to get the right saddle for you.
Everything starts with the measurement of your sit bones. So you need to be supported by the saddle. You need to sit on the saddle. If the saddle is too small, it will always be uncomfortable no matter what you do. For the mountain bike saddles, you need a bit wider nose so you can have more support when you go up steep uphills.
Yep.
We always look for the best pressure distribution, which is not to have the most even pressure distribution, which is one way to go.
Okay.
But that's, in our mind, that's not the right way, because you don't want to have the same pressure on your soft tissues, which are on the saddle, as you want on your sit bones, which are called sit bones because you're meant to sit on it.
Yeah.
So we want to put as much pressure on the sit bones, get pressure relief underneath the pubic bone.
Okay, so you're distributing weight sort of further back on a more supportive part of you and the saddle, rather than resting everything here on bits you don't want it resting on.
Yeah.
I agree to that. SQ Labs have designed a saddle that has their unique steps feature integrated into it. Let's find out why they did this and how it helps us as riders be more comfortable when on the bike. And I can actually see, so if you have a look at this one, it's got almost, it steps up here and here, yeah?
Yeah.
And now, so run us through why or how the various steps in the saddle work.
So the first step, the one on the front, is still for the pressure relief. So you're meant to sit on your sit bones, and then you have pressure relief underneath the pubic bone.
Yeah.
These are the sit bones.
Okay.
You want to sit on here.
So right
possible.
on the end sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. When you cycle on a trekking bike, a mountain bike, a road bike, triathlon, you tilt the hip forward. And you have to do that to get all the power. And then you also move the contact points between the saddle and the sit bones further to the front. It gets a bit narrower.
Okay, yes.
But the problem gets more pronounced because then the pubic bone, which is the bone that will push on your genitals when you ride, will be lowered.
I thought it'd be a good idea to do some pressure map testings with the saddle that came on my bike before switching out to a perfectly sized saddle for my sit bones to see how much of a difference it makes with data to back it up.
On the nose of the saddle.
Yeah, I would smash out mile after mile like
The
this.
sit bones are back here.
So look. So look, if I rotate my pelvis essentially back, watch, this here is gonna make more like marks here essentially. So if we go, see that? So now we're gonna switch it to some SQ Lab saddle and SQ Lab bibs and see what the difference is. And obviously we might do some changes with regards to saddle 4.5 position, tilt and saddle height as well. So the time has come to see how they compare. We have now put the SQ Lab 611 ErgoWave saddle on in a 15 centimeter width to match up with my roughly 14.3 centimeter sit bone distance. So let's get the pressure pad on. This is the moment of truth. If I go, where is it? Here, and slide in. Look at that!
This is a lot better,
Yeah,
but we
Shall I
can
pedal?
still pedal, yeah?
but there's
There you go.
way less.
Yeah.
Oh,
And if you move like half a centimeter further back,
yeah, no, that.
that's too much. There you go. So
Hang on, okay. So I think
need
this
to-
is going to be something I'm going to have to sort of relearn
Yes,
is where to sit.
exactly. Because this is a completely different world of
Yeah.
where the pressure is. Is a lot better. So you don't have a solid
Massive.
connection in the middle. The pressure's on the bones.
And you see how much more it's spread out as well down either side.
Exactly.
When it comes to seat angle then, how did you figure out seat angle? Do you just, they work on like a level, like a neutral
kinda.
setting as it were?
So what everybody else is telling you, put a level on the front and the back, and then level it.
Yeah.
That doesn't work for our saddles because we
'Cause
have
of
the
the-
2 steps.
Yeah.
So the sitting position, the area where you sit on the saddles should be level. That's a good starting point. You can also take the nose of the saddle should be level.
The lasers are out, it's time to perfect my position on the bike. What we're looking for is the joint of my knee to sit just in front of the pedal, so this will give me the most comfortable position, but also transfer the most power through the pedal stroke. I mean, that's the killer thing. Like, when you do a big ride, I think anything over 2 hours can be classed as a big ride, especially for a lot of
Yeah.
people out there. So if you can alleviate the pain in those pressure points, then that's surely got to be a good thing, right? So this is something that can be transferred. So you guys out there, you don't need the lasers. I mean, all the equipment certainly does make life very, very easy, but it's definitely something that from this you can take back and look at your own bike, even just by leaning against the wall and maybe just have someone take a picture of you so you can sort of see, oh, actually my knees are a bit far forwards.
Exactly.
Okay, that's the back half of the bike done, if you like. The saddle's feeling a lot better, it's feeling nice and comfortable, it's in the right position, it's at the right height. So I think now is the time to move forwards. And we're gonna look at the cockpit, so we're gonna look at grips, bars, and potentially stem length as well. So what's the best thing to look out for in a grip? Is it thickness? Is it length, shape of it? You know, this one's obviously very shaped. What should they be kind of?
The grip width is the most important thing. Same with the saddles. We measure hands, we measure the grip width. So
Okay.
actually the circumference, the largest circumference you can grip.
Yeah.
And you choose your grip size according to that.
Okay.
So any decent brand should have grips in different sizes. So that's for the width.
Yeah.
And the circumference, which needs to fit your hands. If you ride with gloves, take one size down, because
Okay.
you lower the circumference.
Yeah, of course.
And then it's just about the shape of the grip and not having a round grip.
Really? So like a purely cylindrical grip is not as good?
No, definitely not. You can actually quite easily see it on the pressure mapping. There's a lot more pressure points because you have the same force you put on the handlebars, you just have less surface to put it on.
Right.
And that's just simple physics, I think.
Simple physics.
This is the lightest possible we could make it.
Yep.
And we went without a clamp for the weight reason. You think saddles are complicated, but grips is just a whole different league. Because I mean, the hands are so different on anybody.
Yeah.
And you feel a lot more with your hands than you do with your butt.
So softer is generally better. And there's obviously a fine line between so soft that it just doesn't last or deteriorate.
If it's so soft that you don't have any of the functions of the shape anymore, then it's too soft. But I think there's a quite quite nice sweet spot of having the perfect softness without losing the shape of the grip when riding.
Okay, so just for people at home, don't just go and buy a cool coloured grip off the shelf. Maybe actually look at how thick it is, what it's made of, like the density of it, and the shaping of it as well.
Yeah, and make sure it fits your hands.
Make sure it fits your hands. There we go. All right, Luke, whilst we're talking all things front end of the bike and cockpit setup, we've covered grips, but I want to talk sort of handlebar. But obviously you guys make a vast array of different bars and different materials. So what really should people be looking for when it comes to setting up the front end there?
What's most important on the handlebar, I mean, the rise and the width is kind of a personal decision. What is important is the back sweep.
Okay.
So most bars that come on bikes, but also in aftermarket, are 7 or 9 degrees. There are some brands that go up to 12 degrees. That's where we start. So we have 12 degrees back sweep, more back sweep than the others, and also 16 degrees for the mountain bike. Because handlebars get wider per day, but the back sweep doesn't change. It's stayed pretty much the same at 7 degrees. And what happens when you make your the handlebar wider, you actually have to
And rotate your wrist.
Move your wrist.
I've noticed that on certain bikes.
Exactly, and that's why just to have like a neutral wrist position, which is never straight. You always have an angle between your arm and your wrist.
Okay.
It's never 90 degrees. It's always tilted anyway. And then you go wider than your shoulders, and then you need more back sweep.
Now let's talk all things material. Let's face it, carbon is what a lot of people go for these days.
Yeah.
You know, there's a difference in a carbon bar over an aluminium bar. Are there any performance gains or losses in any particular way?
They can be both ways.
Okay.
So obviously is the weight difference. Most carbon handlebars on the market will be a lot stiffer than their aluminium counterparts because the material is so strong, so stiff.
Yes.
You can't really get it to bend, or most people can't get it to bend. And this can be, if you just go downhill and you need that ultra precise handling, then the stiffer is better sometimes. Yeah. But for most riders, all the energy gets transferred to your wrist and to your
you got to be
arms.
strong upper body for that, for sure.
Exactly. So it can be a drawback, it can also be a plus. That's why we offer both versions.
Okay then, so the stock front end has been swapped out. The stem length seems to be the right length, luckily, but we've swapped out the bars. So these are the SQ Lab 311 bars, 740 wide with a 12-degree back sweep, and they're the 711R race grip, so a rubber push-on grip that we kind of touched on earlier. How are we looking at the front end with regards to, we've got the right parts, now we just got to adjust them ever so slightly into the right positions, I presume.
Yes, what you can do is tilt your handlebar a bit to adjust the upsweep of the handlebar.
Okay.
Obviously, you can move the grips, rotate them so that when you're in your sitting position, you have the best cushion for the outside of your hands.
Yeah. But otherwise, she's, you know, from the Bikefit we're doing, it's pretty good to go, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels, you know, I'm here pedaling away. I've got my butt nestled where it should be back in that saddle. It feels very comfortable. And you were just saying, sort of with regards to stem length,
Yeah.
we were talking how do we kind of go and adjust that with regards to body position. You were telling me about sort of a 90-degree angle between body and arm.
The idea is that the angle between the upper body and the arm is close to 90 degrees, just below 90 degrees, because when that's the case, you're pretty set in your joints and you don't have to put any muscle activity into pulling yourself into that position or making sure not to move out of that position.
So it's like a nice, strong position to be in, not sort of, and again, if I'm sort of under here, then I'm gonna, you know, put a lot of weight and pressure. It's slightly over-exaggerated, but it's, you know, it's the same sort of thing.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, well, look, the bike is done, so I think there's only really one thing for it. We need to head out into the woods. It's only, we got to get outside, don't we?
Yeah.
Right, we'll see you in the woods. So as much turbo time as you can do trying these things out, the system is on, the saddle, the grips, the bars, you name it. There's really only one thing for it, and that is to head out into the woods and give it a proper ride. And just so happens, the guys are going to join me in a little bit as well. first impressions then, this is obviously a very different setup to what I had previously. We're a few K in now, and I'm liking it. It's taking a little bit of getting used to just position myself on the saddle whilst we're bumping around. But the wider sort of perch, if you like, for my butt to sit on, is definitely alleviating that pressure. Right, Luke, tell me about this active system then, because it's essentially flex in the saddle, isn't it? And I've noticed it kind of when certainly pedaling on rougher terrain, that the saddle almost rocks back side to side.
Exactly. So it's not a dampening movement, it's just a rocking to follow the natural movement of the hip. Because again, we're not made for cycling, we're made for walking, and the hip moves with every step.
Right.
And we kind of try to mimic that on the bike. And it really helps on the long rides to keep especially the lower back, a bit more relaxed, because the muscles can actually contract and then relax again.
Okay.
And don't have to just contract tighten all the time.
I see what you mean. So what that saddle's doing then, essentially, for you guys out there, is it's just pivoting ever so slightly left and right. And you actually have different elastomers, which you can change on the rails. So there's a soft, medium and hard, isn't there?
Exactly.
I mean, it seems a simple but very effective idea, and it's something that I can definitely feel when I'm pedaling on the rougher terrain, when I've been sort of really getting, like, pushing through the saddle. You can just feel it almost just flexing. Right, Luke, as our ride draws to a bit of a conclusion, we're near the end. I wanted to touch on the insoles because, like we said earlier in the video, it's not really something that a lot of mountain bikers would think about. But actually, having got the power down a few times on the hills and being in my shoes for a good couple hours now, I can really actually notice the additional support from them.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool product. It gets forgotten most of the times because it's in the shoes. But it does make a lot of a difference. And same thing, we're not made for cycling, we're made for walking, where we need the dampening movement of the foot. In cycling we don't, and that's just really good to support the foot.
Agree, especially sort of in my very stiff XC shoes that I'm wearing. You know, I'm sure people out there, you've seen people walking in ski boots, should we say, where they're walking like a robot. It's like dunk, dunk. You know, so your foot's not allowed to flex, so there's no support for it.
Yeah.
So actually that is where the insole comes in, because that's very similar to what happens in a mountain bike shoe in a way. All right, Luke, we're done and dusted on our ride, and it's actually been a really interesting learning curve, this, because it is pretty different from my setup before. And you were telling me that, obviously, I'm not saying the saddle was uncomfortable, because it definitely wasn't, but it takes a bit of getting used to, is that right?
Yeah, that's completely normal, because you're sitting differently. You're sitting on your bones, probably for the first time.
In a long time.
Yeah,
I mean, you've been telling me off. He's been telling me off a few times on this ride. I'm still sitting, so old habits do die hard.
Yeah, they do. But that's a good thing, that you are noticing that there's something different. Even pressure points on the bones are a good sign. You just have to get used to it after a few rides, a month of riding. With you, a week of riding, your bones should get used to it, and then goodbye to numbness, goodbye to saddle pain.
And hello to probably even bigger rides that they send me on the channel now.
Mountain biking is for people of all shapes and sizes. And as GMBN's tallest in-house rider, I thought I'd share some of the tips that I've learned from years in the saddle to make riding that bit better, a bit more enjoyable and a bit more comfortable. Now, I'm not the tallest mountain biker out there by a long way. Several of my friends are towering above me at nearly 203 centimetres. That's about 6'7", that's huge. However, years in the saddle have given me a lot of pain and discomfort. I've suffered from all the things that taller riders do suffer with. Lower back pain, neck pain, even wrist pain. And then of course there's awful handling and poor bike fit that's all associated with frames that really just aren't designed for taller riders. Okay, so first up, let's talk about frame and frame fit. Now this is something really, really close to my heart and that I've got real strong feelings about, because it's something that I've actually really struggled with over the years and something I've just learned to adapt around until I rode that Mondraker back in 2013. Now that bike really changed everything for me and made me reconsider how bikes should fit taller people. Now if you want to see that video, there's going to be a link in the description underneath this one. Check it out, it's quite interesting and it tells you why bikes like this Nukeproof in front of me are so good today. Now this bike is my personal, it's one of my favourites I think I've ever had, because it really does suit what I like in a bike. It's fairly short travel, it's got big wheels on it, and it's got a really generously sized frame. Now this is key for me. The front end on this has a 515mm reach. That's one of the bigger sized bikes out there for a size extra large. Of course there are some extreme options, but this is a bike that performs well in all situations. The more extreme offerings might be a bit more biased towards enduro racing. Like I said, it's got 515mm reach on the front, but also out back it has proportional chainstay, so they're nearly 450mm. Now that is one of the key things for me. I've ridden many bikes with long front ends, but quite often they have short back ends on them, and that's where they really fall down for a taller rider. The shorter the back end is, the further forward you have to have your saddle to try and get your weight in the middle of the bike, because weight distribution is everything when you're a tall rider. As you'll know, if you're watching this as a tall rider, from going up steep hills, how much you have to hunch down and weight that front wheel to stop it wandering around, and even to stop it wheeling. It can be really quite off-putting. If you have a longer bike in the front end, that's great because you can get more weight on the front end. But even better is if you can have more length on the rear end, which encourages your weight to naturally sit towards the middle of the bike. Having a kind of even bias to the front and rear wheel means not only can you basically ride a lot better and be a lot more comfortable, but it means you're going to be in more control of the bike. Now don't forget, being taller, your weight normally is quite a bit further higher than shorter or average height riders. And the effect of that is when you're riding extreme terrain, ups and downs, your body weight has to move backwards and forwards quite extremely on a bike to keep everything under control. Now sometimes that can be quite upsetting, and that can really sort of disturb the traction you have on your front and rear wheels, especially on the front. If you're maybe going down an aggressively steep descent and you're off the back, trying to stop yourself getting pitched over the front, but there's actually not enough weight on your front wheel for traction. It's a really fine line there. But by having a bike with the front end that's nice and long, it makes things a lot more comfortable, a lot more controllable, and it'll make you feel a lot faster and safer. And more to the point, more fun. That's what it's all about. And like I said, the long chainstay down the back, some riders in the past have said, no, they're not very playful, but it's all about the proportions. Yes, an excessively long chainstay won't be much fun, but a chainstay that is proportional to the front end of the bike, that is where you're winning. Now, this is a size extra large, and it's the biggest one that Nukeproof make. This is the Reactor 290. Like I said, I love this bike, but there are bigger bikes out there. There's a lot of brands that make even bigger bikes, double XLs and triple XLs. Now, there's a few just firing by on the screen at the moment, just to give you some ideas. So if you're one of those taller riders that's on the extremes and pushing 7 foot, you might want to look at some of those brands. Now, as bikes have got more modern, frames generally have got longer and your cockpit basically has got shorter. The whole effect of that is your wheels are further apart and you're more central on the bike anyway, so it's much easier for us now. In fact, it's better than it's ever been to get a really good bike that fits you. But if you can't afford to do that and you're thinking, oh, I'll just chuck like a longer stem on it and stuff, just be cautious of how far you go. Like I said, the further forward you put your stem, the further over the front wheel axle it is. You're actually going to ruin the handling of the bike. And you can't just go, say, for example, slamming the front end of a bike to try and keep your weight down, because your weight's going to end up higher at the back and lower at the front. You're going to be in an awkward position. And more to the point, this sort of thing is going to lead to pain, long-term pain, like neck pain. If your front end is too low, you're going to end up looking up all of the time. Okay, next up then, well, it's the wheel size, clearly. 29-inch wheels, they've got to be the best option for tall people, right? Because they're big and they go over things. There is some truth in that, but that's not why big wheels suit taller people. Okay, so if you skip back here to 26-inch wheels, and if you think about where your bottom bracket axle is in relation to the wheel axles, quite often it would be higher than the wheel axles. Now combine that with someone that's very high up and tall on the bike, and you become very top heavy. Now look at a set of 29-inch wheels and look at that same line. Your bottom bracket actually has to be lower than the wheel axles to be proportional to the rest of the bike for handling, otherwise you're going to be way up in the air. And that alone is the reason that I love 29-inch wheels. Okay, they've got some other great attributes as well, which we're not going to get into now. This is all about the bike fit and the bike comfort and getting the best out of a bike for a taller rider. And for this reason alone, that is why 29-inch wheels are superior for us. They really do get you into the bike. Honestly, I can't sell you on 29-inch wheels enough if you're a tall rider. You know, there's no problem with the handling at all. You only get benefits if you're a tall rider. And as an upside as well, they make your bike look smaller. And that is a huge thing, because the size frames we're used to running back on a 26-inch wheel bike make the wheels look tiny and the frames are ugly. Look at this. This is one of the biggest frames you can get, and it's on 29-inch wheels, and it looks amazing. Okay, so next up is your pedals and cranks. Now, many taller riders, naturally you're going to have longer legs, which means you're going to want slightly longer cranks, and also you're going to have bigger feet as well. Now, I haven't got the biggest feet, I've got a size 46. I run a 175mm crank. That's my preferred choice on any bike, regardless of the ground clearance, purely because of the fact it feels most comfortable when pedaling. Now, some riders out there will say that by having a wider crank, your stance is slightly further apart and it's going to lower you, but you're talking like 10mm difference. So I'm not sure that that is something you can notice, but perhaps if you're doing everything possible to lower your centre of gravity on the bike, and that's one of the things that you can do, then I guess it would come into effect. But the size of your pedals, the shoes that you use, and the pedals that you actually use really do make a difference. Now, if you ride flat pedals, make sure that you've got a sole that's stiff enough on your shoe, and you've got a pedal that's big enough as well. Because if you've got a pedal that's too small, you'll end up with cramps on the outside of your foot. Now, there are several brands out there, like Crank Brothers, for example, that offer pedals in different sizes to suit different sized feet. This is a godsend for taller riders because you can have that big platform that genuinely fits your feet. If you like clipless pedals like I do, then you've got choices there as well in two respects. The first one is the actual size of the pedal body itself. Now, on my cross-country bike, I like a very lightweight minimal pedal, but I can get away with that because the shoes that I choose to use are proper XC race shoes. They're incredibly stiff, which means all your support comes from the shoe. And you don't need that with the pedal. But if, like on this bike, you want to have a bit more fun, then a bigger pedal is probably better because the shoe you're going to be riding in is going to be a little bit more flexible. Now, at the moment I'm using a Shimano shoe. I absolutely love it, and the combination of that with these pedals is brilliant for me. Like I said, a 46 shoe. This is the Crank Brothers Mallet E. Some riders even go even bigger with the Mallet downhill pedal. This one suits me just fine. It fits the shoe great. And I'm also running the longer axles. You can get 2 lengths of axles in these, and the same in Shimano options as well. A wider axle not only gives you a better stance, which is more stable and more supportive for someone that's tall, but it actually keeps your big feet away from the cranks and away from the chainstays. Which leads me on to something else. I've actually got chainstay protection on this bike, and it's not from flying rocks, it's from my ankles wearing out the paintwork on there that costs so much money. And it's well worth doing on your crank arms as well, if that's something that happens to you. Now, of course, this might just be a case of riding with your heels in, but generally if you've got bigger feet, that is something that you're going to suffer with. So definitely take that into account. Okay, so next up then is the cockpit of the bike. Now, if we just skip back again to 26-inch wheel bikes, like I said with the axle height thing a minute ago, there was another issue we used to have. We couldn't get the front end high enough because you'd have the seat post towering out the frame to have your saddle at the correct height for riding. And accordingly, your front end needed to come up because otherwise you'd be all hunched down like a roadie and you start getting the back of the neck pain, not to mention all the bad handling attributes that went along with that. Thankfully, with 29-inch wheels, it doesn't, well, it's not quite so bad, is it? The fact that your bottom bracket is that much lower in comparison to the axles, it means that your front end can be a bit lower as well. But don't get carried away with that. Okay, so a lot of the cross-country racers will slam that front end so their front end profile is really low, and that is great for an attack cross-country position. But I promise you, for real tall riders, it's not that comfortable for the long term. So don't be afraid to go a bit higher on the front end. If your bike fits you correctly in the length, going high is great. Now, this bike actually comes with a 50mm stem as standard. I'm running a 35 on there. I'm running one spacer under it, which is perfect for me with the 140mm fork that's on there. It has a 130mm back end on there, so it's a good balance. Now, as far as the handlebars go, I've gone for a high-rise bar. It's a position that works for me, and it means I can ride all day, every day, and I get no backache and no neck ache. So for me, that works, but you might want to experiment with the height of bars as well. Now, it's a 38mm rise bar on there, and it does make a significant difference to me. But the last thing really with your handlebars, we're tall, we have a big wingspan, if you like. I certainly have. So I go for a full width bar every time, 800mm. Now, there are a few brands out there that offer wider bars, but I don't think there's any advantage to going any wider than 800. And if you ride any sort of single track, any wider than 800, you're going to come into problems. I've had many people tell me that 800 is too wide, and they'll be running a 740 or a 760 because trails are quite naturally in and out of trees. And here and there, all right, you might see me with scrapes on my arms and on my fingers, but it's not often, and I'm willing to take the chance to have the overall comfort, security, and really enjoyment of riding a bike. 800mm works for me. So if you're hovering around 200 centimeters, it probably is going to work for you as well. And the last thing up front is really the size of your handlebar grips. Let's not forget that many tall riders have slightly bigger hands. Now, mine aren't massive, but they're size 11, which is an extra large in gloves. Accordingly, when there's an option to have a thicker handlebar grip, I will always go for that. Thinner ones 100% feel nicer, but you end up wrapping your hands around them too much. That can lead to knuckle pain on longer rides or rougher rides. If you're riding a bike like this, you're going to be riding on rough terrain, so make it easier on your hands and try out a grip with either a little bit more padding or a slightly thicker grip. Now, if you don't want to go for a thicker grip, but you want a grip that's got a bit more padding, look for something that's kind of got the mushroom texture to it. The mushroom profile provides an enormous amount of comfort for something that doesn't necessarily have to be quite thick. Okay, next up is saddle height and position. Now, this makes a massive difference for taller riders. Now, if you're unlucky enough to have a bike that has quite a slack seat angle on it, what that means is the taller your saddle gets, the further over the rear wheel axle it gets. Now, that's not good for climbing on steep stuff because it means you're going to really have to hunker down over that front wheel. So running your saddle slightly forwards on those rails and even slightly nose down can help you sort of return a better position for climbing. Of course, there's a fine line between the angle of your saddle, and that's something it does take a while to figure out. But a little cool secret I've found is using an e-bike saddle. Now, I discovered this on my GMBN bike, which is a specialised turbo levo. Had an e-bike saddle, thought, really, e-bike saddle, what's so different about it? It turns out on e-bikes you can ride up pretty much anything, so having a saddle with a shelf at the back really enables you to keep that power down and stay in a more efficient position. But I found it works brilliant for me on all bikes. I'm a convert on it now, although the one downside is it is a little bit harder to get off the back of the bike, but I found it ridiculously comfortable for basically all riding. Now, you note that even though this bike doesn't have a very slack seat angle, I do prefer to run my saddle quite far forwards. I have quite a short upper body with long legs and long arms, so it just works for me. But just note that the further backwards you run that saddle, the harder it's going to be for you when you climb. Now, with regards to a seat post, if you're lucky enough to be able to get a dropper post on your bike, go for the tallest drop you can. That's a 170mm drop. 170mm drop is absolutely fantastic because it means that you can get the saddle completely out of the way and keep your body weight really low down on the bike. The lower your body weight is, the more safe and secure you're going to feel when you're riding off-road. Now, going hand in hand with your saddle position, and of course everything else on a bike, because it's all relative, is your shock setup. Now, as a taller rider, fine, you might be a bit heavier, like that's not what we're going to talk about here. The leverage that you have on your rear shock when you're climbing seated makes a big difference, especially if you have a slack seat angle on your bike. With a steeper seat angle, your body remains much more central on the bike, and as a result, you basically don't disrupt the rest of the bike so much. You can sit down and spin those circles. Whereas if you have a slack seat angle on your bike, your saddle ends up miles out here, and as a result, regardless of your suspension design, you can end up really wrenching through your lower back when you're climbing. Now, I used to really suffer from having a bad back, and it took ages to figure out why, because I was doing core stability exercises, the position on my bike wasn't that bad, the bike at the time was about as big as it could get. It was an old Ibis Mojo HD in an XL. I think I had a 70mm stem and probably an 800 bar or near enough to it. It was a bit as big as it could be at the time. but I really suffered from lower back pain. And I actually got to ride quite a lot with the distributors of Fox suspension in the UK. And they actually noticed something when I was climbing, that I was really wrenching on certain steep climbs, and they were sure that that had something to do with my back pain. And sure enough, watching the rear shock on the bike, I was really going through the travel going up the hill, but yet that bike had quite high anti-squat. It was nothing to do with the suspension, but your body weight, your mechanical leverage on there, if you're really cranking, can alter everything. So what they ended up doing was, I think the shock at the time was a Float X, and it had the CTD system on it. So it had a 3-position, kind of similar to this, a much older version of it. Now I used to run it in the mid setting for climbing because I still wanted traction, so I didn't want to have it locked out. But by having it in the mid setting, it enabled it to firm up a bit. But they re-shimmed it so it was really firm in that mid setting. And the effect of that was the bike just stopped doing this on those climbs that I was really struggling with. And you know what, it really did help my lower back. So your suspension settings do have some kind of difference. I mean, that's something that affected me on a particular bike. And if you're getting lower back pain when you're wrenching up those climbs, then perhaps that could be a little help for you as well. Okay, now just a bit of info about some of the other stuff I've found. Now, I'm a bit heavier being taller. Some of you might be lighter, some might be quite a bit heavier. If that's the case, you might want to consider things like stiffer or stronger wheels. In particular, the rear wheel. That's the one that's going to take a big amount of load for you. Now also, while you're at it, consider things like rim inserts if you're struggling with tyres or damaging your rims, or perhaps a slightly heavier duty rear tyre. Something with a reinforced sidewall is a good idea for you. Now, something to take into account being a taller rider is the fact that yes, you're going to be heavier, and yes, it means your smaller friends, even if you've got the same power and fitness, might be quicker than you up hills. Don't be afraid to use a smaller gear. Now, I've had to put up with some of my friends giving me stick for years for having smaller chainrings. My friends tend to pick between 34s and 38s, depending if that's a winter and summer. I'm a 30 to a 34, depending on the conditions and where I'm riding, or if I'm lucky enough, like this bike has, to have 12 speed on the back. Don't be afraid to have a lower gear on there. And if it works for you, even consider an oval chainring. Now, oval chainrings can be really helpful. I've tried them and it just didn't work for me. I'm quite happy spinning circles. I didn't feel like there was an advantage, but I know people that swear by them. So there's definitely something there to consider. Another little option to consider as well, if your bike has adjustable geometry, this one has a little chip on it, which means you can adjust the bottom bracket height of it. Run it low. As low as you can get on the bike. Keep your position down low, keep your body mass down low. Everything is going to make the bike feel more stable and it's going to feel more enjoyable for you. Okay, so you might have to have some recalibration to avoid hitting your feet on the ground in certain rocky terrain, but you can make it work and the bike will handle much better for you. Okay, and a few last tips actually come in the form of riding kit. Now again, one of the struggles of being tall when you ride lots of single track like I do is I'm forever ducking under stuff. As a result, I've pretty much ditched using a riding bag, certainly for shorter rides where I can get away with running a water bottle and having some tools on the frame. In fact, I carry as little as possible and try and put stuff on the bike. I sometimes have a tube strap under my saddle rails there, and sometimes I use like a hip pack if I need to just carry a bit more. But if I can avoid having a bag on my back, not only is it more comfortable for me by removing the weight off my back, it means going under stuff on the trail is far easier. And speaking of things that are hanging low on the trail, being tall means your head's up in the canopy a bit more. Well, maybe not quite up in the canopy, but as a result, you're more prone to stuff hitting you in the face. I know over the years I've had some near misses with some spiky stuff, and I've even shattered lenses on some glasses in the past from sticks and stuff on trees that have been down low. Now, I won't ride anywhere now without glasses on, so for most of the time in the UK that means using a clear lens, but quite often I use a mirrored lens if it's as bright as this. I am a bit cautious of photochromic lenses though, because I don't think they adjust fast enough for the riding that I do. It might be different for you, but it tends to be very bright and then dappled light in the woods, so dark light, dark light. As a result, the lens I really favour is the POC Clarity lens. It actually saturates greens and browns, so when you're in the woods it makes shadows, it enhances the texture, so you can see roots and holes and hollows and stuff a lot easier. There's various other options from different companies out there. I know Oakley do something very similar to that. Well, there we go, that's some of the tips that I've learnt over the years as a taller cyclist. Now I've got to say a massive big shout out to Connor over at GCN and gmbntech. He did this similar video, I got this idea from him, and he's massive.
We're lucky that mountain bikes cover a broad range of sizes these days, but sometimes riders at either end of the spectrum can feel a little shortchanged. So as GMBN's shortest rider, I thought I'd give you some tips that I've learned over the years on how to get the best bike for a short rider. Having been a bike journalist in the past, I've ridden many different bikes from many different brands, and no one seems to have the same opinion on how to build a bike for a smaller rider. Some will just scale down the front end, some will scale down the chainstays as well. Some will give you completely different wheel sizes, so 650B only for shorter riders. Sometimes components are scaled down too, like the stems or even the crank lengths. But there's no one size fits all. However, I'm going to go through some of the things that I've learned over the years that'll help you pick the best bike for you as a shorter rider, some of the things I consider, and something you can do to fine-tune your ride after you've bought it, just to make it feel really custom fit. So when you're looking to buy a new bike, it can be a bit of a minefield searching for a small bike. And what does small actually mean? Small could be for a 5'5" rider, which would be no good for me as a 5'1" rider. So generally brands will tell you the ideal range of a height for a particular small. They should list it in the geometry spec at the very least. So you don't need to be a geometry geek to know what sort of geometry you need to look for in a new bike. If you've ridden bikes in the past, you should be able to find the geometry of that year and that model on the internet. And then you can write them down and start to compare notes between bikes. I like to write stuff down in a notebook or a spreadsheet and start to identify things like, did I get backache? Did I struggle to maneuver the bike? Was it tough turning in corners? And all those sorts of notes will start to build up a little bit of a picture about what sort of geometry works for you. Without going into a great deal of detail about geometry here, there's two measurements that will make the bike feel a little bit too big or too short. So the top tube length, that's a number that you want to look at for when you're sat in the saddle. Anything too large, if you feel too overstretched when you're pedaling or sat down in the saddle climbing, then that's a number you might want to scale down for a new bike. The reach is down here, and it's something that you want to look at for when you're stood up on the bike. So if a bike felt too long when you were going around corners or stood up with a saddle down, then perhaps you want to scale down the reach. I would look at the seat tube length and think about how close that saddle is going to be. If you're on a trail bike or an enduro bike, you want it to be as low as possible, because a dropper post will accommodate your riding position, but you want it to get out of the way for when you're descending. Consider that my inseam is about 79 centimeters, so anything close to that is actually really going to get in the way. Also consider the standover clearance up here, because if you ever touch down on technical terrain, it can be terrifying to get back onto a tall bike with a high standover. Anything from 20 millimeters can make a massive difference in your confidence in getting back on a bike. So some brands will scale down the chainstays for shorter riders. This is a bit of a debatable one. Honestly, I've ridden bikes with the same chainstay lengths that feel lofty in some brands and nimble in others, because there's so many other numbers in the geometry chart that will affect how nimble a bike feels in the corners. Personally, for me, what's more important is the bottom bracket height. As a small rider, I find that cornering can feel like a really big movement. So the lower you are, the less of a movement it feels, to me anyway. And also it keeps the standover clearance low as well. So I would always go for as low as possible. And sure, you might have some pedal strikes if you're riding through rocky terrain, but honestly, I don't find that that's a problem that often. Most of the time I'm freewheeling through rocky terrain. Wheel size seems to be the biggest debate when it comes to smaller riders. A lot of people will tell you that a smaller rider should be on smaller wheels. I've not really found that to be the case as such. I think you should pick the wheel size that you want and the ones that suit your style of riding. Don't pick something just because you think a shorter rider needs it. Now, 29er wheels, they can be a bit of a fight in the corners, and they can be a little bit troublesome in slow tech descents, for example. But I think everyone faces this kind of problem. They have a bigger gyroscopic effect, which kind of fights you in the corners, but every rider will go through this. It's not just a short rider problem. Now, I absolutely love mullets. I love the space that you get at the back. I love how nimble they feel in the corners, and they're really manageable in tech. But I do think that 29ers are faster, and I'll always run 29ers when I'm racing, and I'll run mullet when I'm having fun on the trail. So in conclusion, I would pick the wheel size that suits you, and don't be pressured into something just because you're a shorter rider. Now, don't just run a new bike straight out the box as it is. You might need to customize some of your components. It should be a given that you're getting your handlebars cut down at least, because everyone runs different widths, everyone has a different width on the upper body, and you're just gonna have to experiment to see what works for you. I run something like a 74 or a 76, so try something like that. And also try some slim fit grips as well. I've got small hands, like a small to extra small in gloves, and the Ergon Slim fits fit me really well, and I tend to get less arm pump when I'm not holding onto a grip that's too fat. If you can't afford a new bike just yet, or you're not sure what you want from your new bike, but you want to test some things out, you could invest in a couple of stem lengths. So 10 or 20 mils shorter can feel a massive difference. You can also try moving up and down the steerer to try and get a feel for whether you like a lower front end or not. So crank lengths is something I'll always look for, and it's something I always upgrade, and maybe it's a pricey upgrade, but consider getting a crank set that you can transfer over to new bikes year on year. I run a 165mm crank length, mainly because I can't get hold of a 160mm. I would if I could. But basically, having a shorter crank length means that your feet are closer together, which makes it more manageable to steer the bike and maneuver when you stood up. But it also brings your foot closer to underneath your knee for a more efficient pedaling position, and a less painful one on your knees as well. Now, obviously, every rider needs to tune their suspension according to their weight. But if you're similar weight to me, then you might find that you're right at the bottom of the charts when it comes to recommended air pressure and compression and rebound settings. But what if you're off the charts completely? Or what if you're running your compression wide open and it still feels too firm? There's a few things I've learned over the years that can make that feel a little better. So a little bit of background on suspension forks. It's basically just a big old damping unit to stop you from bottoming out completely. You'll have air in one side on an air fork, which will start to resist as you go deeper into your travel. And on the other side, you'll have oil. And basically you have these stacks of shims that drive through the oil. And the bigger the shim, the harder it is to go through the oil. The smaller the shim, the easier it is to go through the oil. But when you buy a bike, your forks are generally standardized. They're set up for an average weight. But if you're a smaller, lighter rider, it's probably going to be a little over damped for you. So it might feel a little firm in that initial stroke. Now, incidentally, this is what a women's tune is. It's effectively a light tune. They'll have different shim stacks to accommodate for that lighter rider. But it is something you can achieve on standard forks. If you take it to a specialist, they can adjust those shims for you and make it feel just a little bit softer and a little bit more buttery in the initial stroke. If you're buying a bike from scratch, something you may want to consider is coil suspension. So obviously you can get coil rear shocks, but you can also get coil conversion kits for air forks as well. The thing I like about coil suspension is you can play around with different coil weights and tailor it to your specific weights or to what sag you like to run. And you won't need to take it to a specialist like you will with air. Setting up your suspension can feel like a bit of a minefield with air, compression and rebound to think about. And I do think it takes time to settle into the right feeling for you and your new bike. But you can get to a decent base setting in just 10 minutes with a shock pump. And I'm going to show you how right now. So stay tuned and give us a like if you want more short infos like this in the future. So setting up your sag will be the first thing you'll need to do, and possibly the most important thing as well. Now, sag means how deeply you sit into your suspension when you just sit on your bike or when you stand on your bike leant up against a wall. For forks, you tend to have 20 to 30% sag, and for the rear, you tend to have about 25 to 30%. Generally, your manufacturers will give you a recommendation. So for example, your forks might say that you should run 30% sag, or it might be a personal preference. You might want it slightly firmer or slightly cushier. So you will either go to the lower end of the percentage for firmer or to the higher end of the percentage for a more cushier feel. Often the manual for your rear shock or for your fork will give you a weight chart, and it will tell you how much air pressure you need to put into that system in order to match your body weight. But this is very much a guide, and what I will say is measuring it is far more accurate, and you won't have to compete with their opinion of how a shock works, or you won't have to weigh yourself either. You can then put your backpack on and all your kit, sit on your bike and see how much that bike sinks into the travel. So to set up your sag, if you have some O-rings on your forks or your shock, then you want to reset them into their furthest position. So for the rear, you push it all the way towards the air can or the biggest part. And for the forks, you want to push it all the way down towards the lowers. And then we get on the bike, preferably in your usual riding kit. If you wear a backpack all the time or most of the time, you want to be wearing that as well, as it will be more accurate than just your body weight. Then we sit on the bike, and it's better to be at something you can put your foot on, but a wall is better so you can lean up against it. And then you effectively want to stand up, get your whole body weight onto it, and then come off. And then you can see how much your O-ring has moved. Now, if you have a measuring tape or perhaps some calipers, you can measure how much it's moved by and then divide that by the full travel. And that will give you a percentage, which will help you work out whether you have chosen the right amount of air. Now, if you're lucky like me in that you have rock shocks, they might actually have the percentage sag measurements written on the side. So here in my forks, it looks like I'm running about 25 to 30% sag. And then in the rear, it looks like I'm running 30% here. So you might want to even that out. I might want to put some more air in the rear to match the front, or I might want to let out a little bit of air so that they're both 30%. Either go with the manufacturer's recommendations, or if you know you want something cushy, stay towards the 30%. If you want something a little more firm and poppy, go towards the 20 to 25%. So compression just means how easy, effectively, it is for your forks or your rear suspension to compress. And you'll see a plus and a minus on your dials. Usually compression on forks is up at the top right. And with shocks, sometimes it could be hidden away, but often compression is blue and rebound is red. So once you've got your sag and your air measurements perfect, then if your suspension feels too firm or too soft, it's probably something you need to be playing around with in the compression or the rebound, more likely compression. So compression is compression damping. So if you're going towards the plus, you're adding more damping, which is more resistance, and it will feel firmer. So rebound is how easy, effectively, it is for your suspension to return to its full stroke after compression. So if you have a rebound dial, and most shocks do, even the base shocks like this one still has a rebound dial, and they're often found in red like this one. On your forks, it's usually underneath your fork. Sometimes it's under a cap that you need to remove. And again, you're looking at that plus and minus arrow. If you're going towards the plus, you're adding more rebound damping, which makes it harder for it to return back to its original form. And less means it's easier. You might find that if you're a heavier rider, you will activate a lot of energy into compressing your shock, and then it might rebound quite quickly. So you might want more rebound damping than is recommended. Whereas someone like myself, who's a lighter rider, won't activate that shock that often or that easily. So I might want less rebound damping so that it speeds up that return. Either way, you're going to need to play with it because it can be a personal preference. Often you'll see a little tortoise and a little rabbit instead of a plus and a minus when it comes to rebound. So the rabbit is making it faster or less rebound damping, and the tortoise is making it slower or more rebound damping. Also, if you've got high-end suspension, which separates out your, say, compression into high speed and low speed, then this can really fine tune towards your style of riding. So high speed compression is your forks compressing under high impacts, like big square edge hits or coming off of a jump. So when your forks activate quickly. Low speed will be when your forks activate or compress slowly. So that might be applying the brakes and just moving forward, or it might be going into a corner and just sinking into your suspension somewhat. And that applies for rebound. You can get high and low speed on that as well. And separating out those two is great if you know what you're doing, but again, you're just going to need to play with those and figure out what's best for you and what's best for the tracks that you ride. And finally, okay, this isn't within those 10 minutes, but you will need to test this out. This is like the most important thing to do, and you shouldn't try and save time on it. You need to go and ride your bike. Go to your favorite trail, ride it a number of times, just for half a day, and try it. See what you feel like on your bike, and try adding more clicks or adding less, maybe 2 at a time if you've got a lot of clicks, and see which way you prefer. See if it makes it worse if you add damping or if you take it off, and try it, because there will be personal preferences as well as the base settings that you've set up. Well, hopefully that's got you some way towards setting up your bike and it feeling really good. But don't be worried if it takes a couple of months to get it all perfect. The dropper post has to be one of my favorite inventions on the mountain bike, but it's also the most annoying if it doesn't work or if you break a lever like I have. But don't worry, I've got a few hacks and trailside maintenance tips for you to keep you riding, so don't go anywhere. Sadly, I've managed to crash my bike and completely break the lever here, which means my dropper post is now stuck in a down position, which is great for getting to the bottom of a descent, but if I need to climb back up, the problem is you can still pull on the cable to actuate the dropper, but it won't stay up. There's no longer enough tension to keep that up, so I won't be able to sit on it and ride up. However, you can kind of bodge it a little bit to keep the post up. So if you actuate the dropper, then you do have a barrel adjuster here, which if you wind anti-clockwise, it will put tension on the cable. Now try and jam the lever into place to create tension on that cable, then it should create enough tension. There we go. So I can now sit on it and ride away. Now, the great thing about jamming your lever into place to keep it up, like I mentioned earlier, is that you can undo your work and still be able to get your post down for a descent. However, if you're going for a ride home and you want it to be completely in place, locked upwards, then you're going to need your trusty zip tie. So get it as jammed in as possible. Perhaps pull the barrel adjuster out, and then what you want to do is get your cable tie to keep that adjuster, the barrel adjuster, out of the main body of the lever, and then fit your lever into place as best possible, and then you'll be using your cable tie to fix that all together. It's actually surprisingly common how often I see inner cables for dropper posts broken on the trails. And if you're out doing a long distance ride, you're in the middle of nowhere, this could make the worst ride of your life if your dropper post doesn't work properly. So I always carry a spare inner cable or shifter cable in my bag, as well as a multi-tool. And if you've got the room, then a pair of pliers with some cable cutters will really help as well. It could save your ride, although I will show you a hack on how to finish up your cable at the end if you don't have a set of cable cutters. So now you've got all the tools for the job, and you've moved your outer cable out of the seat tube here so that you can refit it. And it's just a case of replacing that inner cable. Now, this is why it's really important to practice with yours at home so that you're nice and comfortable with it if you have to do it out on a trail, because different posts operate in different ways. Mine has its own little ferrule that attaches to the cable. Sometimes dropper posts use the end of a gear cable to sit into the dropper post, and sometimes that end goes at your lever end. So you really do need to check what yours does and make sure you can change it before you go on a nice long ride. Now, I promised you a cable tidy hack. If you've changed a cable on the trail and you don't have a set of wire cutters or cable cutters, then you just want to tidy this out the way so that it doesn't flap around or scratch anything or catch on anything. Now, obviously you can loop this around multiple times to get it out of the way and twist it in on itself, but it tends to unravel over time. So what I found is if you make those multiple loops over your cables, say your brakes or your lever cables here, multiple times. So wrap it around your fingers and then get the cable and tie it around on itself, in and out through the loops. Then that will secure it in place, and the cables will actually stop it from unraveling like a slinky on your bike, and you should be good to go. If your dropper post is becoming difficult to operate, maybe you're pressing the lever and it's really slow like this, or if it's really hard to get it down and it's just not working properly, it's possible that there's not enough tension on the inner cable to operate the dropper. So it's almost like you're not pressing the lever enough. Now, we can adjust this tension. So what I need to do is get that barrel adjuster turned all the way clockwise, so the barrel adjuster is in and it's in its least tension position. And then what I can do is undo this bolt at the lever and pull some of that cable through to give it a little bit more tension. And that should hopefully fix that. And if I need any extra tension, then I can use the barrel adjuster again to wind it anti-clockwise. So if your dropper post is a bit sticky and a bit slow and you don't think it's a cable or a lever issue, then it could just be a bit dry or it could just be a bit dirty. Now, if you've got a car nearby and you have your tools in it, perhaps you're at Trail Centre, then you could get a quick fix on this by using some silicone spray on the shaft or maybe even a chain lube around the shaft, and then just operate your lever, your dropper post to go in and back out, and that should try and draw out some of the dirt that's underneath the collar, and it may even put some lubricant back into it to get it running a bit smoother. So what you need to do is when you get back home is give that dropper a nice good clean and a re-grease. So what you'll need to do is unscrew that collar, get some isopropyl alcohol in there and give it a good clean, and you'll be replacing it with suspension grease, not normal assembly grease, because that can be too thick and it'll make your dropper run slowly. So suspension grease is a little thinner, more viscous, and that will keep it running faster and smoother. So hopefully these tips will have helped you, but if you've adjusted any cable tension, perhaps you've put a new cable in and you've done all of these tips, but your dropper post just isn't quite working right, then it's probably time for a service.
Mountain bikes may well be tough old things that can take a hell of a pasting out on the trails, but they're not invincible. It's entirely possible that you're slowly, or actually in some cases rapidly, aging your pride and joy. So let's take a look at those things that really do kill your bike, and more importantly, what you can do about it. Okay, so let's start with bearings, loose bearings in particular. Every mountain bike, even one that doesn't have rear suspension, will still have quite a lot of bearings on there. You've got your rear hub, you've got the free hub body itself, you've got the bottom bracket, you've got the front hub, and you're going to have the headset. And then added to that equation, if you have a rear suspension bike, there's going to be shock mounts on there and any pivots that you have on the back, whether they use regular bearing races like these or cartridge bearings, or if they use bushings. Now, they all wear out and they all have problems. Now, if you ride with loose bearings, firstly, you're adding friction to your ride, so that's firstly not a good thing. Secondly, in the form of, let's say, rear suspension, if you're riding with loose bearings, just say 2 of them loose, maybe the main pivots, that means there's going to be movement, and that movement will translate to additional wear on the other ones. So really is an essential thing to A, make sure there's no hindrance to the movement of your back end of the bike and that nice suspension action you're paying for, but also B, to make sure you don't prematurely wear all the other bearings on there, because it's all connected together. Now, bearings, given the nature of how they're used on a bike, they will wear out over time. No bearing is going to be completely invincible. So it's down to you to basically maintain them as best as you can. Some bearings we've done videos on, you can basically eke out a bit more life from them by flipping off the seals and putting some more grease in. It's not going to improve a badly damaged bearing, but it will help a dried up bearing last that bit longer if need be. Now, what you're looking for is a bearing that is smooth and a bearing that has no play in it. You will find a well-maintained bearing or a new bearing has a slight resistance to it. That's purely from the grease that's on the inside and from the seals. Now, if I just tweak this one past the microphone, you'll hear that it probably doesn't have much of a sound. Whereas if I take a knackered old bearing, I think this is off Steve Jones's bike, you'll hear the difference. So what you're hearing there is, in fact, pitted surfaces on the inside. It's all grinding round, and the actual bearings are basically been dragging on the inside of the shells of that. So bit by bit, that's falling to bits. And if you continue riding a bike with these all over it, A, it's going to feel horrible. B, its back end's going to be all over the place. You're going to get ghost shifting. Generally not a good thing. And the long-term effect is it can damage your bike. So make sure you keep an eye on all the bearings on your bike, and you won't be ruining it. Now, most mountain bikes these days will have a suspension fork on the front. Obviously, this is a very old one. This is a Fox Talus. Now, the problem with stanchions on a bike is they're subject to ingesting all the muck and moisture into them. Now, as you know, a suspension fork is essentially made up of a few key components. Other than that, they're all the same. All right, so the fundamental basics are the lower legs with the brace connected, that is known as the slider. The upper legs here are known as the stanchion tubes, and then you've got the crown steerer unit. Quite often, the upper tubes, the stanchions, will be one part, and it's known as a CSU. These essentially slide into the outer leg. There will be bushings on the inside of that, and then there will be a foam wiper and a seal. Now that's all there is to it. Of course, there's dampers and other systems on the inside. Now the key to making your expensive suspension fork last is by firstly keeping them clean. Secondly, keeping them serviced. Even a basic lower leg service will keep your fork going considerably longer than not doing anything. And the last one is making sure they don't look anything like this. And if they do, stop riding them immediately because you're just causing yourself more damage. So this will have been ridden in poor conditions, probably never serviced. And due to the telescopic nature of a suspension fork, as it's operating, you are slowly pulling in mud and muck into the fork, which grinds up and down, wearing out the bushes that help the fork slide in the first place. And then of course, wearing out the more expensive legs. The bushes can be replaced. They're a consumable part. They're designed to wear out over time. The legs are not. And as you can see here, this one is in absolutely awful condition. And effectively, this was a write-off, this fork. I've actually got this from a suspension tuners. This guy sent their forks there to get them serviced and went home with a new pair of forks because these could not be serviced. And again, if you look at this, these shouldn't make any noise going down here, but it feels like sandpaper. It's the worst. If you can even hear that. Oh. 10 quid, 20 quid, 30 quid, 40 quid, 50 quid, 60 quid. Lubricated even can help. If you apply some basic fork oil to these upper legs here, just above the seals, compress your forks a few times, it will ingest some of that in there and it will help basically keep them nice and supple. What you do want to be careful of when you are doing this is make sure you don't get any oil near your brakes. Make sure that cannot happen. Preferably do it with the front wheel removed from your bike, just to basically safeguard yourself. Keep them nice and clean. Do a lower leg service. It's a really simple job. People get freaked out by a lower leg service, thinking it's something crazy. Essentially, all it is removing 2 bolts from the bottom of the fork, pulling the lowers off, draining out a very small quantity of oil, sometimes as little as 10 cc on there, and basically putting them back on again. It's very, very simple, and that will make your forks go on for a long time. Henry has just made a video on real-time fork servicing, so that is something you're going to be able to check out and follow along at home. Think of it as a bit of a cooking program. Nice and simple. Again, no excuses from you lot. It's a nice, easy thing to do, and it will save you a fortune in the long run. A worn chain. In fact, a worn transmission. Now, this is something that it's a consumable part of the bike. You're gonna wear it out. However, you can make it last a bit longer if you follow a very simple rule. And that rule really is replacing your chain when it's worn. Basically, it's quite simple. If you replace your chain just before it's knackered, you're going to be able to make your chain rings last longer, and your rear sprockets on a cassette will last longer. And the reason for that is there's a thing called chain stretch. Now, your chain doesn't actually stretch. However, the chain pitch will get slightly longer. The components of a chain are you have these outer plates, you have the inner plates, you have the rollers, basically they're effectively like bushes, and you have the pins that go through them. Now those rollers get worn, and in doing so they enable the chain to actually the links to stretch and move around. As the pitch changes very slightly, as the chain stretches, what's going to mean is that basically it's going to wear on a different part of that tooth. The next thing you'll see is the teeth will start hooking. You can see this on really old knackered cassettes and chains and on the sprockets. And the effect of that is your chain will start hooking onto the drivetrain. It wears them into really fine points, and then suddenly you've got to replace everything. Well, I say suddenly, this is a thing that can happen over time. Get yourself a chain checker, plenty available on the market. They enable you to check your chain. And whilst you're at it, also, take a good look at your chain as well, and the rear sprockets and the chain ring. You can actually look at the teeth and you can see damage to them. What you're looking for, or what you're not looking for, is hooked teeth. Now, they're quite easy to identify. You can see a really worn out chainring against a brand new chainring. They look very different. When you're looking at your chain, make sure if any parts of the outer plate are stepped out a bit. That's a classic example of where the chain will snap. And that chain will snap under pressure, which means it's always going to be in a bad situation. Throws your body weight forwards over the handlebars, suddenly you're using your face as a brake. So it's not a good thing. So make sure you keep an eye on your chains. Brake pads. Obviously, you need brakes on a mountain bike, and you will be ruining the way your mountain bike rides and performs, and potentially some expensive parts of it if you don't keep an eye on your brake pads. Now, they pretty much do their own thing until they're either contaminated, in which case they're usually fit for the bin, or when you wear them out. Basically, you're going to need to replace them. That is something you're definitely going to have to keep an eye on, because no brake pad lasts the same as another one. It completely varies on how much you use your brakes, the size of your braking rotors, and of course where you ride and the conditions you ride in. Now, the construction of a brake pad, so you've got a metal backing plate, then you have your pad material. Essentially, they're bonded to that plate. But when they wear out, you can actually end up braking just using that metal plate. Now, I shouldn't need to tell you that that's going to be damaging for the rotors, and actually it can be really bad for the pistons as well. So do take care and make sure you check your brake pads from time to time. Very important. When you do inspect brake pads, the best way to do it is to remove them from the caliper. I do recommend putting some rubber gloves on, like latex or nitrile gloves, and the reason for that is you still have oils and stuff in your hands that can contaminate the pads. This one is already contaminated, so it doesn't matter that I'm holding it like this, but do take care and you keep an eye on those things. Now, there's one more thing that's actually very important and often overlooked. Is the disc rotors themselves. Quite often people replace their brake pads when they're worn out and just carry on the same rotors. You usually can, but they're not going to last forever, because using metallic based pads on a metal rotor, you are going to wear that rotor down. At some point it will fail, so it's important to check them. Be careful using your bare hands on it because of the oils in them. You don't want that to go near the actual braking surfaces, but you want to check for any sort of scoring on that surface. If there is some, that's a good indication that it's worn out. The best way is to get yourself a set of digital calipers or verniers to accurately measure the thickness. Definitely check your specifics with your brake manufacturer. For your own safety, check it, because the other alternative is using your face as a brake. Worn out paint finish on a bike. Needless to say, you will have spent some money on your mountain bike at some point, and you're going to want it to stay looking good. Now, some people are more precious about this than others, but what really counts is the fact that you're riding a mountain bike in an off-road environment. You're around nature's grinding pace. That means mud, that means sand, that means grit. All of that stuff combined with the way that you ride and the conditions you ride in ultimately mean you're going to prematurely ruin the look of your bike. It's going to get old and haggard a lot faster if you don't look after it and take some precautions. The obvious one to do if you have a brand new frame is to take care of it before you even ride it by getting some sort of frame protection kit, something like InvisiFrame. There's various different brands that offer a similar service on the market, but essentially it's a heli tape kit. You cover up all the important parts of the bike that are typically exposed to being rubbed and damaged from various different things. It can just be as simple as the brake cables or the brake hoses rubbing your paint away. You can protect against that using heli tape. The chainstays and seat stays on your bike are often subject to riding shoes rubbing on them, depending how you ride. If you ride flat pedals, for example, you're quite often a bit more ankles in on the bike for a bit more support, in which case you're quite likely to rub some of that paint off, so get them protected nice and soon. The same goes for your chainstays on the top. You probably want a bit of rubber across the top of there to protect it from the constant slapping of the chain on there, so it takes paint off as well as basically making it sound quite awful as well. You want your bike to be nice and silent. The other area you want to pay attention to, of course, is the top tube of your bike. If you ride with any sort of knee pads or any sort of armour on your legs, it's quite likely when you're moving around on the bike, you might not realise this, but you will actually be rubbing the paint away slowly on the top tube of your bike. Now, the final one is the underside of the down tube and underneath the bottom bracket shell, where you're subject to rock strikes and other stuff from flying up. Now, day-to-day protection, again, good old heli tape, anything like that is good to cover it cosmetically. However, if you're doing something like a season at somewhere like New Zealand or Whistler or in the Alps, then you're likely going to be doing chairlift accessed riding, which means you're going to be riding a lot rockier stuff, and you definitely will have rocks flying up. They're going to hit your frame and they can cause a lot more damage. Now, if this sounds like you really do want some heavier duty protection, I quite often refer to Scotch, like a 3M Scotch rubber mastic tape. Now, admittedly, it's not the best stuff in the world, but for this protective purpose, it's actually really, really helpful. If you want something a bit more heavy duty and don't mind something doesn't look quite as nice, use a section of old tyre. We see there's quite a lot with seasonaires, cutting it up and just putting it under their BB shell there and the bottom where you get those worst rock strikes. Not cleaning your bike. Cleaning your bike is the perfect opportunity to get hands-on with it and give it a thorough inspection. Now, you want to be working around your bike systematically. Find a system that works for you. I tend to work front to back. Everyone has their own way. Stick to it so you don't miss any part of the bike. Now, what I mean by hands-on is get a grip of it, get a feel of things. Feel that back wheel, see if there's any play, look at the linkages, see if there's anything going on that shouldn't be going on. Run an Allen key around the bike, make sure all your proper bolts, your pivot bolts, all that sort of stuff, make sure it's all torqued up and tight and taut as it should be. Pay attention to it and clean it. And hopefully you won't be leading yourself to a ruined bike that costs you loads of money. Okay, and the last one is overusing it. Yeah, you might think me mad for saying something like this, but some people override their bikes and basically classically wear them out long before their time. Now, whilst it's amazing to ride your bike all the time, if you only have one bike, it can be a problem. I know plenty of friends that have got a single bike, they commute to work on that bike, they ride them all week in the salt and the grime on the road, then they go out on the trails at the weekend, riding in our typically wet UK conditions, wearing out brake pads, wearing out drivetrains, constantly spending money on their bikes. Sometimes there is a better way. Having a rat bike is a pretty good way of doing this. Now, build yourself up something cheap, just get a second-hand bike, put some mud guards on it, keep that as your rat bike for commuting, all the daily chores and stuff like that. Pop it in the shops, riding to work, riding to college, wherever you need a daily for. It doesn't matter if it's cheap and cheerful, it's not going to get nicked, you don't have to worry about it, and it's going to keep your pride and joy nice and clean and in better condition for the weekends. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't enjoy your bike on a daily basis, but just be aware that you could be prematurely wearing your bike out by using it constantly all the time, and it is a good idea to spend a couple £100 and have that second bike if your main bike is an expensive suspension bike. Well, there we go. There's 7 ways you could be ruining your mountain bike, and hopefully a few tips you can take away and make sure you're not doing that to your own bikes. If you've got any of your own tips like this, let us know in the comments underneath. I'd love to hear from you. And for a couple more helpful videos, click up here for deep cleaning your drivetrain. That's something I recommend really should do that annually. Make sure it stays in good condition. If you're riding conditions like ours, you probably want to do it quite a lot more frequently. And click down here if you want to turn your bike into a commuter. That is turning your existing bike, not buying a rat bike for that purpose. But pretty good video nonetheless. As always, give us a huge thumbs up here at GMBN Tech. Click that subscribe button and hit that notification bell. Cheers, guys.